In 1994, 3 young nuns vanished without a trace from a remote orphanage in northern Italy. No reports were filed, and the official explanation claimed they had been called back to the Vatican. But decades later, a hidden chamber beneath the chapel would reveal a harrowing truth, one rooted in silence, faith, and a secret buried deep underground. This is the story they tried to erase. The soft murmur of evening prayers drifted through the cold stone corridors of Campo Ardo Orphanage. Perched on a misty hillside in northern Italy, the orphanage had stood for over a century, its ivy-covered walls whispering stories of salvation and secrets. In 1994, beneath the silence and sanctity, something began to fracture. That winter had been particularly brutal, the kind that curled around bones and settled behind stained glass windows with an unsettling stillness. Inside, Sister Lucia moved quietly, her candle casting shadows along the ancient walls. She had just completed the children's evening reading and was returning to her quarters when she felt it, that peculiar chill, not of cold, but of something else. Something wrong. Lucia was 26, the youngest of the 3 sisters, newly assigned to Campo Ardo, alongside Sister Maria and Sister Elena. All 3 had arrived within months of each other, fresh from different parishes, yet bound by a shared youth, energy, and unshakable faith. They had become beloved figures among the children, playful, kind, and gentle. But that week something had shifted. Maria had begun waking up in the middle of the night, claiming she heard whispers from the chapel below, whispers in a language she didn't understand. Elena, typically vibrant and composed, had grown withdrawn, constantly glancing over her shoulder as if sensing someone or something was always just behind her. Lucia, the most inquisitive of the 3, began noticing things: drawers slightly ajar, pages missing from the nightly logbook, a strange truck parked outside the orphanage on 3 separate nights, all occurrences quickly dismissed by the head of the orphanage, Father Lorenzo, as mundane misunderstandings. But on the night of February 11th, everything changed. Lucia, restless from the tension that had crept into their lives, decided to check on the children one last time before bed. She passed the candle-lit hallway leading to the dormitory when she noticed Sister Maria's door slightly open. The room was empty, the bed neatly made. The chill intensified. Moving quickly, she checked Elena's quarters, also empty. Confused, she made her way toward the chapel, thinking perhaps her sisters had gone there to pray. The chapel was dark, and the heavy wooden doors creaked open to reveal nothing but shadows. Panic hadn't yet set in. Not until she climbed the spiral staircase to the upper tower, where Father Lorenzo kept the only key to the surveillance room. It was strictly off-limits to the sisters, but Lucia's instincts outweighed her obedience. She found the door unlocked. Inside, the console was silent. No blinking lights. No humming servers. The monitor displayed nothing but static. The tapes, each labeled meticulously by date, were there, but when she pulled one marked Feb 10/12, her blood ran cold. It was empty, completely blank. She checked another, and another. All data from the past 48 hours had been erased. Just then, footsteps echoed in the hall. She froze. It was Father Lorenzo. He didn't look surprised to see her there. "You shouldn't be in here, Sister Lucia," he said softly, yet firmly. She stepped back, trying to compose herself. "Where are they? Where are Maria and Elena?" The priest sighed, walking toward the monitor, tapping the static screen. "They've been called back to the Vatican." Lucia stared, her heart thudding against her ribs. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" "Orders came swiftly," he said, his voice calm but unreadable. "And you'll understand in time." She didn't believe him. Not one word. By the next morning, the orphanage carried on as if nothing had happened. The children were told the sisters had returned to their missions in Rome. The staff said nothing. There were no police inquiries, no official letters, just a lingering silence and a void in Lucia's heart. She attempted to send letters, no responses. She tried to call the Vatican office. Every number led to a dead end. The other nuns warned her to let it go. "You're too young to question such matters," they'd say. But Lucia couldn't. Something was wrong, and she knew it. Late one night, 2 weeks after their disappearance, Lucia walked past the chapel again. There was no light, no prayer, but she swore she heard it just for a moment, faint, distant. The sound of a child's cry. She turned, trembling, the echo fading everything down, every sound, every suspicion, every name. And she hid it, tucked behind a loose brick in her quarters. For Lucia had made a promise to herself. She wouldn't stop until she found the truth, even if no one else dared to look. Weeks passed, but Sister Lucia could not let go of the gnawing feeling that something dark lingered beneath the surface of Campo Ardo. Her prayers grew longer, not out of devotion, but desperation. Pleas whispered into candlelight, searching for clarity, for truth, for a sign. Yet all she had were shadows and silence. On a rain-soaked afternoon, she stood by the window of her quarters, her breath fogging the glass as she watched the children play in the courtyard below. Their laughter, once a symphony of innocence, now felt tinged with something else, forced, fragile, like laughter used to mask fear. She had tried to ask subtle questions. Had anyone seen Sisters Maria or Elena since they left? The older children simply shook their head. The younger ones avoided her gaze, offering only a shrug or a muttered, "They went back to the city." But it was the smallest boy, Matteo, who had said something that made her heart skip. "The tall man with the gloves said not to talk," he whispered once, tugging at her sleeve during lunch. When she pressed further, he clammed up, staring at his food until tears welled in his eyes. That same night, while organizing her drawer, Lucia stumbled upon an envelope she didn't recognize. It was thin, nearly hidden beneath a stack of devotionals, the paper yellowed as if time itself had tried to erase it. Her name was on the front, written in Sister Maria's careful script, but when Lucia opened it, her hands trembling, she realized it was not addressed to her. It was addressed to someone else entirely. "To whoever finds this, if I am gone," the letter was unfinished, yet its message was clear. "I believe someone is sneaking children out of the orphanage, at night. I've seen shadows moving in the hallways after curfew, and heard things, whispers, footsteps, doors creaking open that should be locked. I tried to tell Father Lorenzo, but he told me to pray harder. I know he knows he has to. I'm scared, for the children, for us." Lucy stared at the paper, heart pounding. She read the letter again and again, as if the repetition would make the truth easier to swallow. Maria had known. She had tried to speak. And now she was gone. The next morning, Lucia found an excuse to visit the archives room, an old chamber lined with ledgers and personnel files, thick with dust and neglect. It was rarely visited, and the key, kept on a chain in Father Lorenzo's office, had mysteriously appeared in her drawer the night before. She didn't question it. Perhaps someone else knew. Inside the archives, she scanned old delivery logs, guest registries, anything that might show who had been coming and going. There were gaps, entire weeks without entries, blank pages where records should have been. Some pages had been ripped out. Outside the orphanage, in the nearby village of Roseto, an old man named Vittorio told a very different story when approached by a passing traveler weeks later, one who claimed to be writing about abandoned church properties. Vittorio had lived across from Campo Ardo for decades, tending to his goats and garden with the deeper tune of a retired cobbler. But that winter night in 1994 remained etched in his mind. "I was feeding the dogs when I saw it," he said, his voice hoarse with age. A truck, all gray, no plates. Pulled up near the back of the orphanage, no headlights, just sat there in the dark. When asked what time, he was sure. Just after midnight. I remember because I'd just turned the radio off, the forecast was warning of another cold front. I was about to sleep when I heard it, a scream. High, sharp, then muffled, then nothing. He told no one, fearing the church. In those days you didn't question what happened behind stone walls and stained glass. Back at the orphanage, Lucia felt increasingly watched. Doors that had once creaked open now closed silently. Footsteps followed her down hallways that should have been empty. Her candle flickered when there was no draft. One night she woke to find a single feather, gray, coarse, resting on her windowsill. The same kind used in the orphanage's old infirmary, now abandoned. And still, the children's behavior shifted. More quiet, less eye contact. A girl named Sophia stopped speaking altogether. Others began wetting the bed, their eyes dark with sleeplessness. Lucia found drawings under pillows, sketches of dark tunnels, trucks, and faceless men. One image showed a staircase leading underground, the walls lined with cages. Another had a cross, broken in half, bleeding from its center. She tried to confront Father Lorenzo again. He smiled calmly. "Faith, Sister Lucia, fear is the absence of faith." She wanted to scream. The letter, the gray truck, the drawings, the silence. It wasn't fear, it was a warning. Lucia began recording everything in a small red notebook, every noise, every misplaced item, every strange expression on the children's faces. She started hiding food in the laundry chute and marked tiles in the chapel floor with chalk symbols, tracing patterns beneath the pews. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, but she knew she had to keep searching. One evening, as she passed the chapel, she heard humming, not the voices of nuns or children, a single, slow melody, a lullaby. She turned the corner and found nothing, but the air smelled different, like earth, like damp stone. Later that night, she lay awake, clutching the letter from Maria, the tip of her pen frozen above the next page of her journal. Outside, the dogs in the village howled. Inside, the crucifix above her bed had turned upside down, and just before dawn someone slid a note under her door. No name, no handwriting, just 4 words. "They come at night." Lucia didn't sleep. She dressed in silence, lit a candle, and opened her door to the long, dark hallway. Somewhere in that silence she knew the truth was waiting, and this time she wouldn't look away. The note slipped under her door haunted Lucia for days. They come at night. Who were they? And more importantly, how had someone known to warn her? She kept the note folded inside her red notebook, pressing it between the pages like a sacred scripture, a relic of the truth buried in darkness. That week she became more withdrawn, her eyes scanning every corridor, her footsteps measured, her candlelight now accompanied by the soft scrape of chalk across floorboards. She began tracing the shape of the orphanage from memory, noting which rooms were no longer used, which walls felt hollow when knocked, and which doors creaked open despite being locked just moments before. But what she didn't expect was the arrival of someone from the outside, a rare event that brought with it a sliver of opportunity. He came on a Thursday morning, his boots thick with dried mud, his hands calloused from labor. His name was Matteo Russo, an electrical engineer sent by the diocese to assess the faulty wiring in the north wing. Lucia overheard Father Lorenzo greet him with a cold smile and thinly veiled irritation. "The lights are fine now," the priest said, but Matteo insisted. He'd been sent, Lucia took her chance. When he passed by the chapel corridor, she caught up with him, her hands shaking as she pretended to ask about the flickering altar lights. She asked if he'd seen the surveillance room, if the cameras were still active. Matteo tilted his head, curious. "There are cameras?" he asked. "Didn't see any monitors running." Lucia's breath caught. "The room's up in the tower, but I think something's wrong with the recordings." He studied her. She could see he was calculating, weighing the risk of getting involved. Finally, he nodded. That evening, when the orphanage quieted and the children had gone to bed, Lucia led Matteo up the spiral staircase. The surveillance room was just as she remembered, dusty, quiet, and cold. The equipment had long since been powered down, but Matteo examined the dusty console with trained eyes. "Most of these are disconnected," he muttered, pointing to the wiring. "But look here, this system used to run 24-hour recording. See this port?" He pulled out an external drive hidden behind the desk, its casing scratched, the label peeled off. "There's something on here." Back in his van, Matteo powered up his laptop, the screen casting a blue glow across his face. He worked quickly, bypassing corrupted sectors, muttering under his breath. Lucia watched from the passenger seat, clutching her knuckles so tightly her knuckles turned white. Then suddenly his voice shifted. Wait over it, but part of it didn't take. He tapped the keyboard and a grainy black and white image appeared. The angle was from the east hallway camera. The timestamp flickered, February 11, 1994, 2:13 a.m. At first it was just shadows, then motion. 3 figures, women in habits. They moved slowly, surrounded by 2 taller shapes, indistinct in the low resolution. One of the women stumbled. The tallest figure turned and raised a hand. The woman straightened. Then they disappeared beyond the camera's field. There was no sound, just the image, but it was enough. Lucia choked back a sob. It was them, Maria Ellen and herself. No, not herself. It was another figure, but the resemblance was uncanny. She leaned closer. The posture, the hair. It was as if she had a twin she never knew. Matteo backed away from the screen. "This was no malfunction," he said. "This was deliberate. Someone wiped these drives clean and reprogrammed the hardware to erase future footage." He looked at her. "This wasn't just disappearance. This was covered up." Lucia nodded slowly. The weight of what she'd suspected now forged in digital proof. But the question burned inside her. Why? Why would someone erase them, silence them? They returned the drive carefully, hiding it behind a false panel, and agreed never to speak of it to anyone. Not yet. Lucia had learned not to trust whispers, especially in stone corridors. Days later, while organizing medical supplies in the infirmary's dusty storage closet, Lucia found a crumpled folder wedged behind a broken cabinet. The label had been scratched out, but inside were sheets of thin onion skin paper, photocopies warm and fading. It was a draft of medical logs. She recognized the format. The orphanage's health records. Each line was a child, each column a vaccination date, height, weight, general observations. But there on page 4 were 3 names, highlighted in smudged yellow marker. Maria G., Elena S., Lucia B. Next to their names were notations, blood work, psychological evaluation, clearance, Vatican Protocol 17. She flipped through the rest of the stack. Pages 5 through 10 were missing, cleanly torn. Someone had tried to destroy this, but whoever did so missed this draft. On the bottom of the sheet was a note, handwritten and hurried. "Do not file, dispose immediately. D.S." The initials meant nothing to Lucienne at first, but her eyes caught a glimpse of another paper, half wedged into the back of the folder. A receipt from a local hospital dated 2 days before the disappearances. It listed routine diagnostics for 3 adult females, all filed under a pseudonym, Project Sanctus. Lucienne's hands trembled as she read and reread the names. It wasn't just secrecy. It was a pattern, a system, a structure meant to scrub out not just records, but people. That evening she returned to the archives, retracing her steps, this time searching not for logs, but for any hint of Vatican involvement. In the back of a rusted filing cabinet, she found a letterhead envelope, its seal broken, the edges charred. Only one sentence remained illegible from Campo Ardo, clearance authorized under Sanctus Directive, "Do not retain documentation." She stared at the sentence until the words blurred. Samples, not names, not people, samples. From that moment, Lucia's world split in two, the one she had lived in, where faith guided light and obedience led to safety, and the one she had just uncovered, where darkness wore robes and silence was enforced with scripture. As she stepped out of the archives into the cold hallway, the bells from the old chapel rang, but it wasn't the hour. It wasn't any known time. She turned slowly, heart thudding. The bells rang again, and this time they weren't alone. Time folded upon itself in the dusty corners of forgotten churches and government archives, but some things refused to stay buried. Nearly 3 decades had passed since the cold corridors of Campo Ardo last echoed with Lucia's Scaglia's footsteps, yet the shadows she stirred continued to ripple through time like ghosts waiting for absolution. In 2023, far from the Italian hills, on the other side of Europe, a retired military physician named Dr. Ernesto Dalca stepped into the confession booth of a cathedral in Bucharest, clutching a warm leather notebook and a soul heavy with guilt. His breath trembled as he adjusted his coat, sweat beading on his wrinkled brow despite the chill of the marble interior. Across the screen, the priest whispered the ancient rite of confession, and Dalca, voice brittle with age, replied, "Father, I believe I've sinned in silence for too long." He began recounting an event from the winter of 1994, when he'd been a young medic stationed at a private military research facility near the Italian border. One night, he had been summoned abruptly, blindfolded and transported under armed escort to a site he never saw again. There, in a makeshift infirmary lit by gas lamps and smelling of iron and incense, he was told to perform basic medical evaluations on 3 women. All were restrained, their wrists bound with coarse rope, their mouths gagged. They wore torn remnants of religious habits. Their eyes, hollow and bruised, bore the same haunted look. Dalka had protested, asked why they were restrained, what they had done, but no one answered. Instead, a man in clerical robes, face partially obscured by a surgical mask, handed him a list. Temperature, blood samples, fertility markers. "I didn't understand then," Dalka whispered, his hand shaking. "But I remember one of the women said something, barely audible through the cloth. She said, 'They take the children underground.'" The priest on the other side said nothing for a long moment. Then, with a calm voice, he asked if Dalka still had the notebook. He did. He left it at the altar before disappearing into the fog outside, never to return. That notebook, marked with only initials, LME, eventually found its way into the hands of an independent journalist named Anselmo Viotti, a quiet but relentless man who had spent the last 15 years digging into cold cases that crossed the borders of faith and silence. Back in Italy, the abandoned grounds of Campo Ardio had long been sold to private developers, but the foundation remained untouched, a maze of locked tunnels, overgrown courtyards, and padlocked doors welded shut. When Viotti came across the name Lucia Belanti scribbled repeatedly in Dalcott's notes, he cross-referenced it with Vatican personnel logs, orphanage files, and obscure charity registries. What he discovered was a name that had once appeared in a defunct Vatican finance database, connected to a now-dissolved fund titled Progressive delle Purificazione. The trail led him to a convent just outside Verona, where an elderly nun named Sister Benedetta agreed to speak. Her voice was frail but steady. "Lucia was not like the others," she said, sipping weak tea from a chipped porcelain cup. "She asked questions, too many." She started looking at the books. Benedetta explained that in the months leading up to Lucia's disappearance, the young nun had become obsessed with the orphanage's financial records. She claimed to have found discrepancies, large sums of money routed through shell charities, labeled as relocation support or postnatal transfers. When she confronted the orphanage accountant, she was told it was above her clearance. That very night, Benedette remembered, Lucia had come to her room, pale and trembling, clutching a folder. "Told me," Benedette said, "they weren't just moving the children, they were selecting them, based on health, on behavior, on obedience." The folder Lucia had carried contained transaction records linked to a charity run by a now-deceased cardinal who had once overseen multiple orphanages across Eastern Europe. But that folder was never seen again. 2 days later, Lucia vanished. Beate listened in silence, recording every word. When he asked if anyone else had known, Benedetta looked away. "Some of us chose to forget," she admitted. "Others were forced to." She then handed him a rosary, Lucia's. "She left it with me the night before," the old man said she might not come back. Determined to trace the financial links, Viotti reached out to forensic accountants and former Vatican treasurers willing to speak off-record. One document, uncovered in a forgotten audit report, referenced a camp line item B17, transfer of minors per ethical clause. The term was never defined, but beneath that entry was a note, hastily crossed out but still legible under infrared scan. Belanti review, flagged for escalation, reassigned, pending silence. More and more it became clear that Lucia hadn't merely stumbled into a scandal, she had unearthed an operation cloaked in spiritual authority and bureaucratic fog. Viotti's investigation uncovered evidence that at least 3 other orphanages in the 80s and 90s had reported sudden staff disappearances, always women, always after questioning funding or asking to see the adoption logs. One former nun, now living in hiding under a new identity in Marseille, confirmed that she, too, had been warned by her superior, "Never ask about the ledgers, and if you see trucks at night, pray, then close your eyes." Back in Italy, Viotti obtained satellite images and real estate records and realized that despite changes in ownership, the area directly beneath Campo Ardio's east wing had never been developed. In fact, geological scans revealed unusual cavities, anomalies inconsistent with standard basement architecture. When he cross-corrected this with archive zoning requests from the 1970s, he found blueprints for a storage shelter signed off by an anonymous ecclesiastical council. The signature box simply read, "CS by divine authority." Meanwhile, word of Viotti's findings began to circulate in underground journalism circles. It reached the ears of a former Carabinieri investigator, now retired, who had worked on an unsolved trafficking case in 1996. He recalled one detail that had haunted him for years. During a raid on a farmhouse suspected of housing undocumented children, they found a hidden account. Inside, amid scattered toys and clothes, was a stone relic, an orphanage emblem engraved with the Latin phrase Lux Sub Terra, light beneath the earth. The same emblem was once carved into the gate of Campo Ardeo. Viotti printed every document, burned backups, encrypted his files. He contacted Lucia's last living relative, an estranged younger brother named Tommaso Bellanti, now a private security consultant. When shown the footage recovered from the orphanage and Dalcamaway still ran, "I never believed she ran," he said. "They told us she had a mental break, but she used to tell me stories as a kid about how she'd protect me from monsters." He clenched his jaw. Turns out she was right. They just weren't the kind with fangs. And as he stared at the old photo of Lucia smiling beside two other nuns, faces now missing from history, he whispered, "If she's still alive, I'll find her." Tommaso Bellanti's determination to uncover what happened to his sister Lucia reignited a quiet but persistent storm. Armed with decades of obscured fragments, encoded ledgers, and the weight of a family name that still lingered faintly in Vatican circles, he began building a digital repository under a pseudonym, Archivio Fantasma. Meanwhile, journalist Anselmo Viotti continued his search through forgotten diocesan records and blacklisted staff lists, aided now by anonymous informants, former archivists, ex-seminarians, and two retired nuns who spoke in whispers from hospital beds. One such informant, a withered woman known only as Madre Fiorella, provided a final crucial lead before slipping into a morphine-induced silence. One of the sisters wasn't who she claimed to be. She was someone's daughter, someone they couldn't silence outright. That sentence burned into Viotti's mind. He began digging, not into Lucia or Elena, whose records had long since been erased, but into Sister Maria's origin story. Officially, Maria G. was registered as an orphan raised in southern Tuscany, enrolled in convent life at the age of 16. But something felt off. Her entry into the church was oddly smooth, the paperwork too clean, and the signatures oddly consistent across multiple years, despite alleged changes in administration. After weeks of cross-references and regional registries, Viotti finally located a single surviving microfilm file on it was a birth record under the name Giovanna Maria Coletti. The parentage section had been blacked out with ink, but the original carbon copy, poorly filed and slightly askew, revealed a name beneath, Carnina Augusto Rinaldi. The name was familiar. Cardinal Rinaldi had been one of the Vatican's most powerful figures during the early 90s, known for his hardline stance on clerical secrecy and his deep influence over several orphanage programs throughout Europe. He had died from pancreatic cancer in 2004, but his legacy remained controversial, especially among reformist clergy, who whispered of his private projects. The discovery shook Viotti. If Sister Maria was truly Rinaldi's daughter, it meant two things. One, her placement in Campo Ardeo had never been random. Two, the silence around her disappearance may have been enforced at the highest levels, not merely to erase scandal, but to bury family. The next day, Viotti made an encrypted backup of the files and sent a summary to a trusted colleague, Francesca Molinari, another independent investigative journalist known for exposing corruption in ecclesiastical hospitals. Francesca, skeptical but intrigued, agreed to verify the documents herself. She traveled to the regional archives to rephotograph the record, hoping to corroborate Viotti's findings. That evening, after emailing Viotti confirmation of the original signature match and a note that read, "This could change everything," she left her hotel near Via Cassia. She never made it back. Security cameras later showed Francesca crossing a quiet intersection around 10:48 p.m. A black SUV with obscured plates ran the red light, striking her at full speed before speeding off. The impact was fatal. Local police called it an unfortunate hit and run, but Viotti knew better. Francesca had no known enemies, no reason to be targeted except for what she'd found. Her laptop was never recovered, her bag with the birth certificate copies was missing, but her phone, crushed and overlooked, still held a low-res image she had sent to Viotti before she left. Maria's name, the word Figlia, and the unmistakable signature of Rinaldi. The Vatican Secretariat of State, upon hearing whispers of the leaked document, initiated a silent internal review. Officially, it was called Processo Interno sulla Veridicità dei Documenti Ecclesiastica, but insiders dubbed it Il Ritorno dei Tre, the return of the three. High-ranking clergy convened in cloistered sessions, with minutes never transcribed. A private investigator, once employed by the Pontifical Swiss Guard, was discreetly commissioned to validate the claims. His report, circulated among a closed circle of cardinals, confirmed what had already been feared, that Maria Coletti had not only been misfiled under false pretense, but her existence had been intentionally misdirected through Cardinal Rinaldi's personal charity network. Furthermore, the trail of bank transactions tied to Programma della Purificazione had resurfaced in inactive Vatican accounts, suddenly reactivated after nearly 30 years of dormancy. Among those present at the secret review was Archbishop Michele Laurenti, a rising voice within the congregation for the doctrine of the faith. He argued that silence no longer served God, and that the Church had a duty to acknowledge, not obscure, the sins of its past. But he was met with resistance, most notably from Cardinal Borgia, who insisted that opening such wounds serves no one and invites desecration, not reconciliation. Still, Laurentia persisted, submitting a private request to the Pontifical Commission for Historical Truth, urging for the immediate release of sealed Campo Ardite documents. His motion was quietly denied. Meanwhile, Tommaso, working under layers of proxy identities, found evidence that someone else had been looking into his sister's disappearance recently. A monastery server had been breached twice in 2022, and someone had attempted to access the personnel files from 1994. The IP address traced back to a Vatican-owned compound in Switzerland, long used for clerical retreats. He also intercepted an encrypted message string referencing Speranza Persa, lost hope. The term matched a codename used in one of Lucia's recovered notes, which described an underground ledger of children transferred between facilities. One particular phrase chilled him. Some are tagged, others trained. Few are remembered. Tommaso, driven by equal parts vengeance and longing, prepared to go public with the information. But Viotti warned him this wasn't just about missing nuns or falsified birth records. This was a mosaic of manipulation where even the smallest truth could collapse the entire foundation. "We need one undeniable piece," Viotti said, "something alive, something they can't erase. Not a document, not a ledger, someone who had seen the inside, someone who had survived." The search for a living witness consumed Tommaso and Viotti, turning their days into long nights filled with database breaches, interview transcripts, and decrypted Vatican memos. It was during one of these late-night sessions that Viotti, half asleep with a coffee ring forming on his keyboard, stumbled across something unexpected. While browsing through Google Earth historical layers for the Campo Ardite site, he noticed a faint patch of land behind the eastern wall, just beyond the chapel garden. The ground there looked disturbed, not in a recent sense, but in a way that suggested heavy earth movement, like something had once been buried or excavated. The perimeter showed uneven vegetation, a lack of root growth in a perfect rectangular pattern, and a thin trench that curved off like a drainage route. Curious, he attempted to pull up the oldest available satellite capture. The timeline bar showed an image dated April 1994, mere months after the sisters disappeared. But when he clicked, the tile flashed, then returned to 404 error. He tried again. Same result. Every image from the surrounding months loaded perfectly. Only 1994, the critical year, had been redacted. Digging deeper, he found the metadata ID for the original image and traced it through archived backups of older satellite maps, saved by amateur geography forums. One user, an Eastern European hobbyist specializing in Cold War bunkers, had preserved several old files from that era. Viotti contacted him under an alias and, after several cautious exchanges, obtained a zipped folder titled Attack of Application Esct. Inside, nestled among grainy black and white tiles, was the April 1994 image of Campo Ardite. And there it was, the garden's symmetrical rows interrupted by a dark square, a pit, or a hatch. Something sunken and deliberately covered. Viotti enhanced the image using AI tools, and a faint pattern emerged on the dirt surface, cross-hatched grooves resembling a service lid. When Tommaso saw the image, he said nothing for several minutes. Then he whispered, "They buried something, or someone," and sealed it. Fueled by this clue, Tommaso submitted a formal request for geological scanning of the property under the guise of land redevelopment. The local council, now controlled by secular authorities with no Vatican ties, approved the motion, though the paperwork was immediately contested by a private religious trust claiming ownership of the subsoil rights. Suspicious, Tommaso filed an injunction, buying time. Meanwhile, in a separate thread of the investigation, an unexpected tip surfaced. A psychiatric nurse named Raffaella Guerra, who had worked at San Pietro Mental Institute in Bologna, came forward after reading a now viral blog post on Archivio Fantasma describing the 3 missing sisters. Raffaella didn't comment publicly, but contacted Viotti privately through a secure portal. Her message was short. "I think I treated her. 2011. She called herself Mia Milfrid, and she carved crosses into her palms." He immediately arranged a private video call. Raffaella, now retired and visibly nervous, explained that the woman in question had been admitted under emergency evaluation after being found wandering near a construction site, dressed in a makeshift nun's habit, muttering scripture and screaming at loud sounds. "At first, we thought she was just another delusional patient," she said, until she started quoting Latin phrases. But old ones, ecclesiastical, the kind only trained clergy would know. She refused medication. She fasted on Fridays. She insisted on lighting candles every evening, and she kept whispering names. Lucia, Elena, and once, she said, Rinaldi. Raffaella remembered the woman's eyes, glassy, yet full of something deeper than madness. When shown an old photograph of Sister Maria, Raffaella covered her mouth. "It's her," she said. "I'm sure of it." The woman had stayed only 4 days. On the 5th morning, 2 men arrived in dark coats, presenting a release order signed by a federal liaison. They said she was part of a high-risk witness protection program under ecclesiastical jurisdiction, Raffaella said. Took her. No forwarding info, no case file. Her room was cleaned out that afternoon. When Raffaella later tried to access the digital records, the patient file had been scrubbed, nothing but a placeholder ID and a comment. Transferred. Level 0. Tommaso, upon hearing the story, pressed for the Institute's visitor logs. They were incomplete, conveniently. But one name had been scribbled and later crossed out. D. Sandrini, a cleric once affiliated with the Secretariat of State, who had died in 2015 in a supposed stroke after being implicated in a Vatican housing scandal. Viotti retrieved Sandrini's old address, and with the help of a local contact, found his last known assistant, an archivist turned recluse named Paolo Marchesi. After several days of silence, Paolo agreed to meet in a chapel cellar near Viterbo, where he had been living in spiritual seclusion. The man who met them was gaunt, with a Bible in one hand and a USB drive in the other. He said little, but handed them the device. "She didn't forget," he whispered, "even after all they did to her. She remembered the tunnels. Inside the USB were fragments of audio, recordings, secretly made, of Mia Guppers, sometimes weeping, sometimes singing old hymns. But in one file, her voice changed, took us through the garden, under the chapel, the stone steps. 127 of them. It was cold. We couldn't scream. The children were already down there." Tommaso sat frozen. 127 steps. He had once asked Lucia in a letter what her favorite number was. She had replied with that exact number, saying it was how far light must walk before truth is free. Now he understood. She had encoded the depth. Viotti tried to run the voice through spectral analysis. The tremors, the breaks, it matched early voice samples of Maria from a 1989 convent choir recording. The pattern was undeniable. It was her. She had been alive in 2011, and if she had lived, what of Lucia? Of Elena? What else lay beneath the chapel garden, sealed in stone and silence? The USB audio clip from Paolo Marchesi, the murmured confession of a woman presumed to be Sister Maria, ignited something long dormant in both Tommaso and Viotti. They began combing through any remaining media tied to Campo Ardo from before and after 1994, searching for further traces of sound, evidence buried in the static of time. That's when a suggestion came, unexpectedly, from a retired sound technician named Lorenzo Moretti, who had once recorded choral rehearsals for the Italian Archdiocese's seasonal religious events. In a quiet message posted under an old archival blog post about forgotten choirs, Moretti mentioned a peculiar recording made at Campo Ardo in late January 1994, just weeks before the disappearances. The recording, a reel labeled Winter Benedictions, had been archived not because of its musical excellence, but due to a persistent background distortion that made it unsuitable for public liturgy. Curious, Viotti tracked down the tape, buried deep in a dehumidified basement of the diocese's storage in Florence. The label was faded, but unmistakable. They digitized the reel using high-fidelity equipment, filtering frequencies to isolate the ambient noise beneath the hymn. At first, all they heard was the soft echo of children singing Agnus Dei, their voices layered with the tender hum of an organ. But then, at the 23-second mark, something shifted. A tonal drop, almost imperceptible, ran beneath the melody like a fissure. Viotti replayed it again and again, boosting the lower register. Slowly, the interference shaped itself into a whisper, not rhythmic, not sung. It was speech, and then, undeniably, the voice came through, faint, trembling, unmistakably human. Siamo sottoterra, ci tengono qui. We are underground. They keep us here. We are underground. They keep us here. We cannot get out. Tommaso clenched his fists. The cadence matched Maria's tone from the USB clip, and this voice wasn't alone. As they refined the sound further, another voice could be heard overlapping, pleading, then gasping, before the audio cut to silence. It hadn't been an audio glitch, it was a cry for help, layered beneath piety. Viotti consulted an expert in audio forensics, who confirmed the voices were not present in the live performance spectrum, but had been captured through ambient room pickup, suggesting they came from an adjacent location, possibly from beneath the chapel floor where the recording had been made. The cathedral's original floor plan showed a crypt that had been sealed since 1958, but newer blueprints submitted under renovation permits for the orphanage in the 1970s indicated additional sublevels unlisted in public records. That tape alone might have been dismissed as anomaly had it not been for the second testimony that arrived just 2 days later, this time from a person who had lived through the horror. Her name was Clara D'Angelo, a pediatric nurse now living in Siena, who had read about the resurfacing Campo Ardo investigation through a nursing journal that had picked up Viotti's coverage. Clara reached out anonymously at first, asking vague questions about the winter of the disappearances before finally agreeing to meet under strict confidentiality. When Tommaso and Viotti arrived at the small outpatient clinic where she worked, Clara was waiting in her break room, white scrubs neat, her face pale. "I was there," she said, her voice steady but eyes distant. "I was 5. She explained that in 1994 she had been among the youngest children living at Campo Ardo. The sisters, particularly Lucia, had always treated her kindly. "I remember Sister Lucia giving me extra biscuits when I cried," she said with a sad smile. But it wasn't the warmth she had come to recall. It was the warning. "Told me if I ever saw a gray truck parked outside the East Wing at night, I had to hide, under the laundry baskets, anywhere." Clara explained that on the night of the disappearance she had been awoken by a sharp noise, metal clanging, muffled voices. She peeked through the narrow window slats and saw a large gray truck, its headlights off but engine rumbling. There were men, she said. They weren't priests, they didn't speak Italian. One of them had a dog, another kept checking his watch. Clara had been about to wake another girl when a nun, not Lucia, but someone older, grabbed her by the wrist and hissed, "Hide now." Clara obeyed. From her hiding spot, she saw the men escort 3 nuns out the east door, their heads covered, their hands covered, their hands behind their backs. One stumbled. A man shouted, then the door slammed. She never saw Lucia again. For years, Clara repressed the memory, convinced she had dreamed it. But when she began working in trauma care and saw the signs of PTSD in children, her own past resurfaced. And then, one day in 2011, A patient arrived in the ER during her overnight shift, a woman admitted under temporary psychiatric hold. But the eyes, the voice, I knew it. When Clara approached and whispered her own name, the woman flinched, then murmured, "You stayed hidden. Good girl." Before Clara could ask more, orderlies arrived with a new transfer order. The woman was gone the next morning. Claire had spent the next decade convincing herself to forget, until she heard the whisper on the tape. Now, with Clara's testimony and the sanctified evidence embedded within the choral recording, Tommaso and Viacci possessed what neither threats nor time could erase. Voices of the past rising from beneath him in silence. They submitted both pieces to an international human rights committee, using media contacts to apply pressure on the Italian Ministry of Culture to delay the sale of the Campo Ardo grounds. Secretly, they also hired a team of underground surveyors, prepared to map the terrain from beneath, starting with the garden trench and the crypt beneath the East Chapel. Clara, though shaken, agreed to join them for the first round of scans, holding the cross Sister Lucia once gave her, now dulled by time, but unbroken. As the team prepared the ground-penetrating radar equipment outside the old stone fence, a storm gathered in the distance. Wind rattled the remaining iron gates, and beneath their feet, the earth whispered. The first strike of the surveyor's ground-penetrating radar delivered more than anyone anticipated. The scan, taken just beneath the chapel garden, where satellite imagery had hinted at anomalies, revealed a void, an artificial cavity running parallel to the foundation of the orphanage. The cavity was precisely 4.2 meters deep, rectangular, with architectural features inconsistent with traditional crypt structures. Embedded within its surrounding soil were traces of steel reinforcement, suggesting modern construction methods rather than anything from the 1800s when Campo Ardo was built. It wasn't a crypt, it was a chamber added after the original plans were drawn. The survey team immediately reported the anomaly as a potential unauthorized subterranean structure. This technical classification, while dry, had one explosive consequence. It triggered a jurisdictional alert under Italy's Historic Preservation Act. Any structural modifications beneath a registered ecclesiastical site required government approval and permits, none of which existed for Campo Ardo. The file went straight to the Carabinieri's Special Heritage Protection Unit, and from there things escalated quickly. The following week, an unmarked car pulled into the gates of Campo Ardo. Two plainclothes agents, accompanied by a state-appointed forensic archaeologist, arrived under legal warrant to document and seal the grounds for formal inspection. The Vatican filed a protest almost immediately, citing canonical autonomy, but the state held firm. Too many questions had gone unanswered, too many voices had resurfaced, and one man, whose conscience had been heavy for decades, decided it was time to speak. Father Matteo Serra, a retired priest living in Naples, contacted a legal advocacy group after seeing a televised segment on the renewed Campo Ardo investigation. He submitted a notarized affidavit detailing a conversation he'd had in 1996 with a former colleague, Father Lorenzo Bassi, the very man who had overseen Campo Ardo in 1994. According to Serra, Bassi had admitted, under intoxication during a private gathering, that he had facilitated transference of infants from multiple orphanages, primarily Campo Ardo, under the guise of foreign adoption. Some of the babies were never registered, Bassi had said. No paperwork, no birth certificates, just shipments. When Serra confronted him the next morning, Bassi denied the statement and threatened him with excommunication if the conversation were ever repeated. Serra obeyed until now. His testimony was explosive. It linked the unexplained subterranean chamber not just to missing nuns, but to an ongoing operation that may have moved infants through unauthorized channels, likely without parental consent or official oversight. Italian media, initially cautious, began to run quiet exposes. Headlines hinted at clergy-led adoption irregularities and subterranean secrets at Campo Ardo. But the real fire ignited when blueprints, leaked anonymously to Viotti, surfaced, showing a tunnel linking the east crypt of the chapel to a private chamber beneath the orphanage's laundry ball. The plans were stamped in 1979 by a company called Costruzioni Fratelli Vecchi, a firm later dissolved under fraud allegations involving municipal kickbacks to religious institutions. The blueprints were authenticated by civil engineers, and their metadata matched city archives. except for one thing. The document had never been registered. Its existence was known only to a handful of individuals. One of those names? D. Sandrini, the same ecclesiastical liaison who had signed the psychiatric release order for Maria in 2011. The circle was closing. The National Police formally reopened the Campo Ardo case, assigning it a new classification, Operatio Kula, or Operation Cradle. Interpol became aware of the investigation when certain financial records tied to shell charities used to funnel relocation grants showed overlap with similar structures in Eastern Europe and South America. Tommaso Bellanti, despite operating unofficially, was asked to provide a full report of his findings. He refused to be silenced. "They made her disappear," he told RAI News. "But they forgot I had her voice, her handwriting, her prayers. I'm her brother. I never stopped listening." Meanwhile, forensic teams began carefully drilling through the sealed garden site. What they discovered underneath was no simple room. It was a corridor lined with concrete, barely tall enough to stand upright, and sealed at one end with rusted steel doors. The walls bore marks, scuffing at foot level, faded remnants of fingerprints in dust, and in one corner, scratched deeply into the cement, a cross, tilted, and beside it, 3 letters. Inside the tunnel they found remnants of cloth fragments, brown and ivory fabric with traces of linen consistent with religious habits. Further along they recovered candle wax, splinters of wood, and a rusted latch attached to an interior wall meant to bolt the door shut from the outside. It was a holding corridor, a transit point. Someone had locked them in, kept them in darkness. The evidence was mounting too fast for the church to contain. A Vatican spokesperson issued a brief statement denying any knowledge of subterranean modifications at Campo Ardo and asserting the Holy See's willingness to cooperate fully with civil authorities in the interest of truth and justice. But internally, crisis meetings were underway. The Secretariat of State began recalling documents from regional bishops, requesting silence from all clergy who had previously worked under Bassi. Several priests were relocated to retreat postings abroad. Yet one remained within reach, and his conscience, like Sarah's, had begun to stir. Father Filippo de Alienzo, now 78, had once served as assistant liturgist under Father Bassi. He had been present during the infamous Winter of Transfers in 1994. At the time, he had been told the 3 nuns had been reassigned to Vatican duties. He accepted the explanation, but the day after their disappearance, he had discovered something strange in the sacristy. A torn corner of a letter addressed to Sir Leah. The partial message read, "If they find this, know that the tunnel leads not to safety, but to silence. They mean to keep us down there forever." He had kept the fragment, hidden inside a Bible he never opened again. When the new investigation resurfaced and Clara's voice was heard, he retrieved the page. The handwriting matched Lucia's journals found years later in the rubble of the storage wing. She came forward, quietly but officially. His testimony solidified a timeline that spanned decades and institutions. Campo Ardo, once just a place of whispered tragedy, was now a crime scene. And as state archaeologists prepared to break open the rusted steel doors at the end of the tunnel, one of the surveyors heard something odd from the other side. A thud. Not echo, not earthfall. Deliberate. The rusted steel doors groaned as the hydraulic spreaders pushed their ancient hinges beyond resistance, releasing a damp gust of air laced with mildew, iron, and something older, stagnant breath sealed for nearly 3 decades. The forensic team paused, headlamps flickering as the dust settled into view. Beyond the threshold stretched a narrow corridor, low ceiling, walls of unpainted concrete showing signs of prolonged exposure to dampness and human presence. The smell deepened with every step, sweat soaked into stone, wax residue, and aged decay that clung to the edges of memory. As the lead investigator stepped forward, followed closely by Tommaso, whose breath came in sharp, shallow bursts, the light illuminated what once might have been a crude cell. Metal frame beds fused with rust, a rotted bench, and on the far side a makeshift altar made of brick and scrap wood covered in dried wax and blackened prayer cards. But it was the figure curled in the corner, unmoving, that halted them all. A woman, draped in a discolored, threadbare habit, her skin ashen but intact, her form thin yet unmistakably alive, lay on her side, arms wrapped tightly around something she clutched to her chest. Her fingers, calloused and stiff, gripped a wooden crucifix, small, hand-carved, its surface smoothed by years of touch. Tommaso dropped to his knees beside her before anyone could stop him. Mohances moved by her name in a breath that barely escaped his throat. "Lucia?" Her eyes opened slowly, as if from a dream, their brown depths foggy but aware, flickering toward the light, the voices, the sensation of presence after so many years of shadow. She blinked once, twice, then whispered something unintelligible. A medic knelt beside her, checking her vitals, murmuring to the others that she was dehydrated but responsive, vitally stable though in critical condition. As oxygen was prepared and a thermal blanket placed over her frail frame, Tommaso leaned closer, removing his protective mask, his eyes wet, lips parted in disbelief. "It's me," he said, barely above a whisper. "Tommaso, I never stopped believing you'd come," she said, her voice moved as gravel but steady in conviction. Then she reached for his face, her hand feather light, and pulled him into a trembling embrace, the crucifix pressing between their chests. The team fell into silence, the weight of history pressing down around them as two siblings were reunited not by fate, but by unwavering faith and the persistence of memory. As Lucia was lifted gently onto a stretcher, her body so thin it seemed weightless, she held onto the crucifix as though it anchored her to the moment. The forensic team swept the room with cameras and thermal scanners, and in the far corners of the chamber they found two additional remains, partially decomposed, skeletal in form, both dressed in scraps of identical fabric. Dental records would later confirm them to be Maria and Elena. They had died years ago, likely within the first decade of confinement, their cause of death listed as complications due to isolation, malnutrition, and respiratory suppression. But Lucia had endured. Somehow, through the dark, the silence, the abandonment, she had survived. Later reports speculated that a minuscule water leak from a pipe overhead had kept her from total dehydration. Food, if any, had been minimal. Possibly rodents or mold growth sustained her long enough for her metabolism to slow to a survival threshold most couldn't imagine. But no science could explain the clarity in her eyes when she looked at Tommaso. No logic could replicate the strength in her voice as she whispered, "They couldn't take the light." News of her discovery spread like fire across Italy, then Europe, then the globe. The story of the nun beneath the earth captivated journalists, spiritual leaders, scientists, and politicians alike. Vatican officials initially refused comment, but the weight of the discovery, the undeniable physical evidence, and Lucia's own testimony would soon make denial impossible. The moment was recorded, broadcast, and shared in fragments. A woman raised from the depths of silence, wrapped in blankets, a wooden crucifix clutched to her chest, her brother's tear-streaked face pressed beside hers. Lucia was taken to a private recovery facility under tight security. Psychologists, physicians, trauma specialists, all were dispatched under orders not just to heal, but to understand. Her initial words were few, spoken in bursts of memory and prayer. But one thing she repeated, even as the sedation wore thin and the pain returned in waves, was this: "We prayed every night for 30 years. They thought we would break, but faith echoes louder than stone." As she regained strength, her mind began to unfurl, like pages weathered by time but intact. She remembered the first nights in the chamber, the fear, the darkness, the feeling of being buried alive. She remembered the hymns they sang to keep their sanity, the candle Maria had found in her sleeve, the broken nail Elena had used to scratch messages into the wall. She described the man who came once every few months, never speaking, leaving behind only a small container of water, sometimes a cloth bundle with dried bread or rice. She remembered when he stopped coming. She remembered the silence that followed. And then she remembered the scratching in the wall, the whisper through the vent, the other voices, because they had not been alone. The official identification of the remains found in the hidden chamber beneath Campo Ardo came just 4 days after Lucia's rescue, as dental records and fragments of personal items confirmed what many had already feared but long suspected. The two bodies were indeed those of Sister Maria Coletti and Sister Elena Sforza. The news, while not unexpected, sent a ripple of sorrow through communities that had followed the case for years, transforming grief into collective mourning. Plans were swiftly drawn for a funeral that would not only honor the lives of the women lost, but also serve as a public reckoning, a moment of solemn closure for a nation haunted by silence. The Vatican, now fully engaged in public damage control, permitted the burial to occur on consecrated grounds and offered the Basilica di Santa Croce in Florence as the ceremonial site, a gesture that was both acknowledgement and penance. On the morning of the funeral, as gray clouds hovered gently above the city and church bells echoed through ancient stone alleys, thousands of people gathered, pilgrims, clergy, journalists, former orphans, and ordinary citizens who had been touched by the story. A single black carriage carried the simple wooden caskets down cobbled streets, followed closely by Tommaso and Lucia, now steady enough to walk beside her brother, her presence fragile but resolute, her eyes lined with tears but lifted in faith. The ceremony was broadcast globally, and inside the basilica, Lucia was given a moment to speak. Standing beneath the vaulted ceiling, a simple crucifix in hand, she addressed the world. Not with rage, but with grace. "We were taken, yes," she said, her voice trembling but unwavering. "But we were never alone. In the dark we found each other. In the silence we prayed. And through it all we believed, not just in God, but in the day someone would remember us." She paused, pressing a hand to the crucifix she had carved by candlelight in that hidden cell. "You remembered?" Following the funeral, Lucia was transferred to a secluded care facility in the Umbrian countryside, where medical and psychological teams worked gently to restore her health. Her body, weakened by deprivation, slowly regained strength through weeks of nourishment and rest. But it was her spirit, scarred yet luminous, that astonished those around her. She began writing again, using old fountain pens and linen-bound notebooks gifted to her by Clara, the nurse who had once hidden under baskets at Campo Ardu and now stood at her bedside, not as a patient advocate, but as a lifelong friend. In those notebooks, Lucia chronicled the 30 years beneath the earth, not with bitterness, but with reverence. "We were not forgotten," she wrote. "Even when the world tried to bury our names, our prayers reached beyond the stone. We lived because we believed, and we believed because the light, even in fragments, was real." By spring of the following year, Lucius requested a transfer, not to a hospital, but to a monastery. She chose the Convento del Madre dell'Esperanza, a small, unassuming cloister nestled between olive trees on the outskirts of Assisi, where the sisters lived simply, served quietly, and took in children with nowhere else to go. The Mother Superior, having watched Lucia's story unfold from afar, welcomed her without hesitation. She was given a small room, a garden plot, and a seat at the evening meal. Within weeks, Lucia became Suorlus to the children, a gentle presence who never raised her voice but carried a strength that made them instinctively draw close. She tended to Scrape's knees, taught them old hymns, and told bedtime stories by candlelight, always finishing with a whisper. "And in the dark, we listen." Word of her new life spread in quiet ripples. Journalists requested interviews, publishers offered memoir deals, and documentary crews proposed multi-part specials. Lucia declined them all. "This isn't a story about survival," she told Tommaso one morning as they sat beneath a fig tree sipping tea. "It's a story about what survives." Tommaso, now working with advocacy networks for survivors of institutional abuse, respected her choice. He still visited often, bringing her books, candles, and updates from the world she'd been forced to miss for 3 decades. Sometimes they sat in silence, sometimes they laughed, but always, always, he kissed her forehead before leaving and whispered, "I kept looking." And she would smile and reply, "I know." The old site of Campo Ardo was eventually converted into a memorial garden, its substructure reinforced and preserved as a historical site of remembrance. A marble plaque at the entrance reads, "In memorial di che l'hanno pregato nel buio, che la luz sia la loro eternita." Beneath it, a simple engraving of 3 crosses. Visitors leave flowers, letters, candles, sometimes children's drawings, and in one corner, a laminated copy of a handwritten note placed in a glass frame. It reads, "We were not forgotten. We lived by faith." It is signed simply Lucia. In the monastery chapel, where light spills through arched windows and olive branches sway gently outside, a small group of children kneel in evening prayer. Lucia stands behind them, hands folded, gaze lifted, not to the heavens above, but toward the doorway, as if expecting someone. For even now, she believes there are others still in the dark, still waiting, still praying, and for them, she lights one more candle. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more real-life inspired mysteries we uncover every week. What part of this story struck you the most? Do you think Lucia's survival was pure faith, or something more? And where in the world are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts.